So first, we're going to be focusing on the writing process. So we have specific tips on how to go about incorporating quotes into your writing. Actual examples. I think for this type of lesson, examples are going to be our best friends. So we have a lot of those. And then the second part, we're going to go lightly into in-text citations. If you attended our avoiding workshop or our avoiding plagiarism workshop, it's going to be somewhat similar to that, but a little bit more specific to the MLA format. So let's get going. So one of the things we ask is that you be present and engaged in the workshop. If you're here for extra credit, there is an evaluation form we ask you to fill out at the end. We ask you for your name and your instructor's name, and then we let you know that they've attended. There are 2 assessment questions within that eval to make sure that you're just engaged with us and paying attention. And then feel free to use our chat box if you have any questions, or you guys have been awesome so far, just like asking, which is amazing. That never happens, so I appreciate that. So I think we're off to a really good start. And I think I do have a poll question here somewhere as well. So we just ask that you be actively engaged. Again, there is an eval at the end. I will provide a link for you to fill out some information so that if you are here for extra credit, we can let your instructor know that you're here. So just make sure you're paying attention. All right, so very quickly, I want to go into what do we mean by like incorporating quotes into your writing? I just want to be very clear what this workshop is about. So this mainly started because I, as a librarian, help reference at the research desk. We get a lot of questions about like how to cite a quote or how to incorporate a quote into your writing. And I can help you create a citation, but I can't tell you the writing process about how to like introduce that quote or how to make it flow within your writing so that you have a good like rhythm. And so when we're talking about incorporating quotations, we're talking about the act of actually doing research, finding evidence or something that you want to point to, and then include in your essay or in your writing. A lot of times you're going to be asked to include like 3 or 5 sources in your essay or even in like your speeches or other assignments you're doing. So we're talking about the actual process of taking that resource and incorporating it within your writing. Is there anything you want to add to that, Lynn? I'm sure you as the English instructor maybe have even a better way of describing that for us.
I think you did great. And I will add that we're going to talk both about how to properly technically incorporate these things into your writing, how to cite them, etc. But also, when should you quote, when should you summarize, when should you paraphrase the source material into your writing?
Thank you. That's awesome. And so if you did attend our workshop last week, we talked about paraphrasing and summarizing and how it's really easy to plagiarize that way unless you know how to do it correctly. So this workshop is showing you how to do it correctly. Now, I have a quick poll question for you all. And just so you know, it is anonymous. I am going to launch a question on your screen. And I know that it can be really hard to incorporate quotes, but I'm curious what you find might be the hardest part of it, because I know it's something within the writing process that sometimes we struggle with. So I've just put a poll. Hopefully it's come up on your screen. And these are just some things that I personally thought that might make that process a little difficult. So here I'm asking, why do you think it's hard to incorporate quotes into your writing? 1, the quote already says what you want it to say, so you don't have anything else to add. 2, I have to use a certain number of resources, so I feel like I have to find a quote and just fit it somewhere. I don't know how to create the citation to go along with it in my writing process, so I'm just a little hesitant about it. Or there might be other reasons. Feel free to use the chat box if there's something we don't have listed that you find might be a little frustrating or that you're having difficulty with. Getting lots of responses. Thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to wait another few seconds. The poll's been up for almost a minute. I think we only have 1 or 2 people
actually
left.
click on the poll or put your message in the chat, and I'm going to attempt to follow the chat screen while Sharday is talking and vice versa.
Yes, so no, if you don't feel comfortable talking, you don't have to. Feel free to use the chat. Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share our poll results. And then this way we can all see it together. So thank you for the person who added, I'm a little hesitant because you want to avoid plagiarism. So I can see how that would be a deterrent, because if you don't feel like you're doing it right, like, what am I going to do? It looks like our two biggest winners in this instance is the quote already says what I wanted to say, so I'm not sure what we're going to add. And I definitely know Lynn will be talking about how to do that today. And then I don't know how to create this citation that will go along with it. So I'm going to be talking about that today. So I'm happy to hear that what we're doing is kind of fitting your needs or what you're hoping to get out of this workshop. So thanks. Those are great answers, because that's exactly what we planned on doing today.
Yay.
Yay. All right. Now at this point, I'm going to go hand things over to Lynn. And if there's anything, I'll be watching the chat box. And if there's anything you want me to add or contribute, just let me know. But Lynn, it's your show.
Okay. And as you said, feel free to jump in anytime, Sharday. And also, if I need to be moving along, let me know as well. For everybody in attendance, this is the first time I've done one of the workshops in coordination with a librarian, so I want to make sure I do it right. So the first point I want to make is that all academic writing, unless your instructor tells you to write just a summary or just a personal response, should should involve other people's ideas. It might be, you might be referencing things that came up in a class discussion, or something your professor said in a lecture, or an article that you had to read for the assignment, or a TED Talk you watched, whatever. So academic writing always involves the ideas of others. And you want to remember that as you're formulating your point. So there's two kinds of ways to kind of start with this, incorporating the source material. And one is to start with what other people say. By the way, I'm going to be sharing a lot of templates on the screen, and these are also available in a worksheet that you will find on the link that Sharday will give you at the end of our session. So you don't have to quickly scribble all of these down, because you'll be able to access them. Our slides, I have a lot of writing on them, which is my fault and not always a good idea, but that the templates are in a separate worksheet. So you want to make sure that you respond to the source's ideas, because that, number one, that shows your readers, including your instructor, that you understand what the source says, and that you can formulate something to say in response to it. And it's really simple to do that. You can do it sometimes just with one sentence, as these templates imply. So like the second or the third, second one down, yes, some people believe blank. You can use that template to start with if you're talking about the public in general. Or you could start with an author's name. Jane Doe believes blank. And then however they overlook, and then you put in your own point of view. Some of you might recognize this if you've ever encountered the book They Say, I Say. I'm taking this material, this material is inspired by that book. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. The other option is you can start with your own ideas and then have the sources come second. So these templates are just reversed from the first slide. So if I look at the first one, it says, I believe that blank, which is different than many scholars assume. So, and you don't have to use the word believe. You can be more forceful in your language. We should blank. We should pass laws to curb the use of non-standard size baseballs in regulation baseball play. I don't know, making something up. All of my examples in class had to do with baseball usually. So you state your point, and then you can state what the source says about it. So either starting with the source and then responding to it, or starting with your point and then bringing in the source material.
Is that when I'm at the reference desk, I see a lot of students who say like, well, it already says what I want it to say, so I don't know what else to do. So what I really like about Lynn's examples here is that like it's really emphasizing the fact that you should only be introducing this if you already have something to say and the evidence is either supporting it or contradicting it. Can't talk. Uh, but like really what we're seeing here is the initial process is you have a thought that you're putting out there, and then that evidence is either supporting it or contradicting it. I can't say that word for some reason. I hope you all know what I mean. But if you ever feel that way, this is the strategy, right, to address that, it sounds like, Lynn, because you're introducing
Absolutely.
your thought and then the evidence.
Yes, your instructors want to know what you have to say about the topic. They don't want your sources to write the paper. They want you to write the paper and then use the sources to help that. I had an instructor once who said, make sure you control your essay. Don't let your sources control your essay.
Ooh,
And I
I
think
like
that's
that.
excellent advice. So the thing that's exciting about academic writing is you're putting together new knowledge. You're saying something new that nobody else has ever said before. And the sources are just there to help you say it. They're not there. You have more authority because it's your own idea. And then your writing gets more authority because you're quoting sources showing that they agree. And I might add one other thing here. Um, it is great if you can find a source that you can disagree with. Oftentimes, students will say to me, I can't find any sources that say what I want them to say. Well, that's that. And I say, great, I'm so glad that happened because that really means you have something new to say. So what you need to do is approach the source on its own merits. Look and see what the source says, and it's probably not going to be exactly about your topic, but it's going to have a point that you can relate to your topic. And that's part of your job when you're doing an academic essay. That's part of creating new knowledge. This other person said something that's similar to what I'm going to say, but it's a little different. And I was able to take what that source says and apply it to my topic. So if you find sources that you disagree with, even just partly disagree with, that's great if you can talk about that in your paper.
I love that. That will make your research process a lot easier as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm
Okay,
gonna.
next slide. Okay, so the title of this workshop is called incorporating quotes into your writing or something like that. But I wanted to remind everybody that you don't have to quote. You can paraphrase or summarize. In fact, in my classes, I tell students I would rather you paraphrase or summarize than quote. Now, you should check with your own instructor about that. They might have specific requirements that you actually use quotations. So you paraphrase means that you want to incorporate something detailed from your sources. So let's say that your source has a paragraph of information and you want to convey most of those thoughts into your essay. That so that the length of your paraphrase is just about the same length as the original paragraph. That's a paraphrase at the same level of detail. Summary, on the other hand, is when you just give the main points. So maybe your source talks about the topic for 3 pages. Obviously, you can't incorporate 3 pages worth of your source into your essay, but you can condense it down to maybe just one paragraph to cover those 3 pages. So the difference between paraphrase and summarize is the level of detail. Now, you still need to cite your sources because those ideas belong to your sources. And Charday is going to cover how to cite those sources correctly. You need to let your readers know that these ideas came from these sources. But the language in your essay is in your own words. You're not taking the words of the author, you're just taking the ideas.
The paraphrase.
For paraphrase or summarize. Usually you paraphrase shorter passages from the source because you're including more detail.
And I would add, when we talk about avoiding plagiarism, When we say plagiarism, we're not saying directly quoting. If you use someone else's idea in any way, shape, or form and put that in your own words, that is plagiarizing. So that's why we want to talk about how to properly paraphrase and summarize. If you're
Yes.
using someone else's ideas in any way, then you have to contribute where that information came from.
Thank you. So you see at the top of the slide, it says point number 2, 3 ways to incorporate source material. All 3 of these ways that we're going to talk about you must give credit to the author, whether you're paraphrasing their ideas or summarizing their ideas or quoting. And you can go to the next slide. So directly quoting means that you are taking the exact words of the source. You're not taking the ideas and putting them in your own words. You're actually taking the words themselves. And that's the main difference. So,
Lynn, would you say that like paraphrasing is just like a slightly different version of directly quoting in the sense that like you're not using their words exactly, but you're using their words close enough and their ideas close enough that it's just like one step down from directly quoting?
yeah, I think it's good to think of it as a middle step between summarizing and directly quoting. So if you want to stick really close to the author's original language or the level of detail, then you're paraphrasing. Now, I will say, one thing I ask students to do when they're paraphrasing is read the paragraph in the source that they want to paraphrase and then close the book or close the file or whatever. And then write your paragraph without looking at the original source. Force yourself to do that because then you're sure you get your own wording. When I say your own wording, I don't just mean that you change a couple of words. Your sentence structure should be a little bit different. Your own writing should not look, your sentences should not start out the same way as the sentences in your source, for example. And if you force yourself to quit looking at the source, you're more likely to get your own words. Now, you can always go back and double check to make sure you didn't forget something. But when you're doing your paraphrasing, you really should close the book. It's a hard habit to get used to, but it's very valuable. Okay, so one thing I wanted to cover with directly quoting is there are some definite times you should quote and should not quote. So you can go back and read this slide again afterwards, but I do want to highlight those darker bullet points. Some good reasons to quote are when you want to give emphasis to an authoritative source. So let's say that you're talking about the theory of relativity. It might be a good idea to directly quote Einstein, since he came up with a theory. That would probably lend credibility to your own writing. Or if you're writing about gun control laws and you are quoting some nationally recognized expert on the subject, that's a really good reason for a direct quote. That will help you as a writer. A second reason to directly quote is if you want to analyze the specific language of the quote or emphasize one or two words. So you include the quote and then you go back and talk about some of the language in it. And I will tell you that this is a great strategy. If you're not sure how to comment on the quote or explain how it relates to your thesis statement or something, a great way to do that is by looking at the actual language of the quote. Maybe there's a verb in there that you want to emphasize because it really gets to the important part of what the author is saying. Or maybe a phrase of 3 or 4 words together. You can go back and talk specifically about that language. A third reason why you would want to directly quote is you want to spice up your own language with the writer's vivid language. This happens a lot in English classes when students are writing about literature or poetry, because those authors are used to using vivid language that's memorable. Like if you're taking a class, you're writing a paper on Hamlet, and you come to that famous quote, "To be or not to be, that is the question." That would be a good phrase a good sentence to paraphrase because it's vivid and lots of people know what it is. They've heard it before. So that's a good reason to directly quote. The fourth reason that you should consider using directly quoting something is that your assignment instructions say to use quotes. That's a really good reason. So if you find yourself quoting beyond these reasons, consider summary or paraphrase instead. Don't just quote every time you want to bring up an author's idea. Get used to practicing putting what the author says in your own words. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Here are some reasons not to use direct quotes. Number one is to add length to your essay. Those of us who teach see this all the time, and don't forget, we were students for a very long time. Most of us went to grad school, so we know all the tricks to add length to essays. Directly quoting is not a good reason. You're much better off summarizing or paraphrasing an idea and then talking about it at length. A second reason not to quote is because you can't figure out how to say it better. You can. This is your essay, your topic. You know what you want to convey to the author. You just have to get kind of in control of the language that you're using. It does take some practice, but if you practice, it will get easier. And the final reason not to quote is if it's possible to summarize or paraphrase, in other words, to put it in your own words. Okay, so I've covered a lot so far. We talked about stating your ideas in response to another author or starting with the author and then giving your ideas. We talked about paraphrasing, summarizing, and quoting, and when to quote and when not to quote. Does anybody have questions at this point?
So I definitely feel like I've learned some things. So just from what I'm hearing from you, Lynn, is that direct quotes are something that you should use sparingly under the conditions that you mentioned earlier, and that typically it's better to use the paraphrase or the summarizing. Of course, you have to cite those ideas, but that it tends to work better within the writing of your paper overall because it allows you to provide like that analysis and introduce it in a way that is conducive to you as being the main authority of your paper.
Yes, that's well said. Thank you. It is if you're using a direct quote for one of the reasons on the previous slide. So it always strengthens your writing to talk about your sources, but sometimes you can talk about those sources using summary or paraphrase rather than quote.
All right, are we ready for the next slide?
Yes, ready for the next slide. Okay. So this slide next couple slides have a lot of information on them, so I'm not going to belabor it, but I just want to point out to you that there are these slides, and these are also on the worksheet. These gives you the correct way to deal with quotes, summaries, and paraphrases. So there's two steps. The first is to introduce the source material with a signal phrase. And the second step is to explain after the quote or the summary or the paraphrase passage. So a signal phrase, that means that's the author's name plus a verb. And then you can see on the list there that I give you several examples. Simple as saying something like Johnson argues, or Smith points out that, or Walker suggests that, or Anderson reminds us that. That's a signal phrase. And it's good if you start talking about your source material with a signal phrase, whether you're using a paraphrase, summary, or direct quote. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. After that, you want to make sure you explain what's important about the quote. If you can imagine a reader, the reader is reading your work and saying, oh, student Johnny has a great point about X. He's writing an argument about X. And then all of a sudden, Johnny is quoting Johnson, and I don't quite understand why Johnson is in there. When you have a framing sentence afterwards, that tells your reader why you're quoting. It makes it very clear. Okay, I think we're ready for the next slide, Sade, unless you have something to add.
My only thought is when I tend to help students with their research, I think like they think, oh, I have to write 5 pages and that's so much. Like my research topic's really broad because I need to put a lot in there. But if you're going through this process of introducing the source, actually paraphrasing it, and then explaining the source, that's a lot of writing. Your paper actually is going to go by very quickly if you are properly incorporating these quotes. It takes up space in your paper. You don't need filler because this is your content.
Thank you. And that's the first thing I tell students. If they're telling me they're having trouble coming up with meeting the page length requirements, I ask them to go back and look at how they're incorporating source material. Make sure you've got the signal phrases and framing sentences. And you're absolutely right. Okay, and then after that, at the top of the slide, it says point number 3, frame your quotes, don't be a hit and run quoter. A hit and run quoter is someone who just has a standalone sentence as a quote. So if you look at on the left where it says author Harriet Jacobs, it says author Harriet Jacobs exposed the hardships of the lives of slaves in her autobiography, period. And then a quote, and then parentheses with documentation. So if you do that, that saves you from being accused of plagiarism because you're clearly giving source a credit to the source. But you can improve your writing by directly framing the source. And if you look on the right, you'll have a new way of saying this. This is an example of a properly framed quote. Harriet Jacobs, a former slave from North Carolina, published an autobiographical slave narrative in 1861. She exposed the hardships of both male and female slaves, but ultimately concluded that slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Basically, Jacobs is trying to point out that the very real hardship of female slaves have been largely ignored or forgotten. So if you look at the length of that one bullet point on the left that I read and the length of the one on the right, you can see that the one on the right is much longer because it's properly framed. That's how you meet page length requirements, and that's how you build credibility as a writer.
And this is a perfect example of you introducing said author and then explaining or doing analysis at the end. I'm also going to point out here that I had mentioned there's going to be an assessment question in the eval. We're not trying to trick you. This is one of the assessment questions in the eval. So we are going to ask you, what is a hit and run quote? So if you could summarize it in a sentence or two, Lynn, what would you say a hit and run quote is?
A hit and run quote is not properly framed.
Thank you. That's to the point. I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in our next section, we're going to go into the actual citation part of it. And this is where I'm going to tell you initially that there are different subject areas. And so when we're talking about citing, that's the part that makes it so that you're not plagiarizing. The citation at the end of your paraphrase, your summarization, your direct quote, lets us know who said those words and where we can find them again. Now, there's different types of formats for creating citations, and I don't think we talk a ton about where that's coming from. So just to give you a little background, you probably use MLA the most, and that is because it is used in the English department the most. It tends to be a little bit more humanities focused. And so they're going to have you format things in a very certain way. That means they want you to put the title or the author name in a certain place, and certain periods and certain things have to be italicized differently. Compared to APA, once again, they're going to have their own format. And APA tends to be used more for the social sciences. So you'll see this in psychology, sociology. So whatever format you're asked to use is normally dictated by what type of class you're taking. So if you're taking a psychology class and are asked to write a paper, they're probably going to ask you to use APA citation. If you're in an English class and they ask you to cite, they're probably going to ask you to use MLA. There's also Chicago that is not used as often. When I was an undergrad, I was a history major, and so I used Chicago a lot, but it's probably not something you guys are going to see very often at SFCC, so we're not going to focus on that as much today. Since we do have our writing instructor here, we are going to be focusing on MLA for the examples in this presentation. But do know there are resources to help you learn how to do both. Now, I just want to be very clear when it comes to avoiding plagiarism. You have to give credit for everything. I know we're talking a lot about words, but this includes text, images, music, video clips, anything that is someone else's work or idea, you have to give credit for. So if you think like, I'm just going to like put this image in my essay and I'm not going to say where it came from, your teacher is going to have some issue with that. They're going to want that as part of your citation. So do know it's whatever idea anyone has ever had, you need to document. And that includes for summarizing and paraphrasing. Now, I want to be very clear about what an in-text citation is. So I'm guessing probably a lot of you have had to create a works cited page or a reference or a bibliography where you're asked to create a citation. And the citation at the end of a paper typically includes the name of the author, the name of the journal, the name of the video, the name of the book, what page you got it from. The in-text citation is the part that appears in your paper. So this is where you've quoted, you've summarized, and somewhere within that text you indicate where that information came from. So I can take that little in-text citation and look at your works cited page to figure out more information about it. Now, in-text citations look slightly different based off of what style you're using. Here, I just want to give you a visual of pretty much what I just explained. So you have your paper. Within your paper, especially with MLA, the two components that they ask you to include in the in-text citation is the author's name and the page number. And then that way, in theory, I can take this information and then go to your works cited page at the end and read the full citation. And that way I could actually go find this article, this book. I can go reread what you had indicated or had interpreted, and I can make kind of my own conclusions. I can verify what you said was correct, or if I'm interested in the topic, learn more about that topic. So the whole idea here is not just giving credit to who that information is coming from, but the ability to find that information again. So for MLA, the two things that you need for sure within that in-text citation are the author's last name. Now, sometimes there isn't an author's last name, in which case you would use the title of the work. We get asked that question a lot. And then the page number. If you're using APA, they're more specific in the fact that they're going to want the year of the publication as well as the name and the page number. So honestly, it really just depends on what format that you are using. The thing that I think is most important to you is examples. So if you have questions about that, let me know, but I do want to get you guys the link to this workshop page so that you can have examples at the time that you need it. I find that tends to be the most helpful. I know when I was a student, I lived off of examples of things. So I'm going to share in the chat box with everyone real quick our link to this workshop guide. So we have a number of workshops. We do weekly workshops every quarter. So for every workshop that we have made, there is information here. So if you're working on an annotated bibliography, if you have questions about plagiarism, we have all those resources listed to the side here. For this particular library guide, I'm going to go ahead and put the link into the chat box. So this is something that you guys can copy and paste and save or bookmark or come back to later. Now on this guide, we have the presentation itself that we just viewed. So if you want to go ahead and look through the presentation as we have just shown it, you can do that. But what I really love about this, Lynn has made a handout with examples from our presentation, and it gives you actual tools so that you can practice introducing those quotes, doing an analysis as a follow-up. You can actually print this out so that if you want a copy of this to take with you, save with you, if you're writing an essay and you want to refer back to how to actually do this and have examples, everything's right here on this guide for you. If you scroll down, we have some other information about incorporating quotes. You will notice at the bottom there's a citation. We did use this from another school under Creative Commons, which means we said where it came from, but they have some great information here and tools also for incorporating text. So if you're just interested and want to do a little bit more of your own research, that's on this guide. Now for the citation portion, I just want to point out that on the left-hand side, we do have direct links to resources that will help you create the in-text citations. We have one for APA as well as one for MLA 8. There are also examples, including worksheets. I mean, if you had extra time, which I know students have very little of, but if you wanted to test yourself, there is a worksheet on here with an answer key. And then, of course, I have some videos here that will help you make the in-text citation. So it's always one thing to attend a workshop. Hopefully this has been helpful, but I know when it comes to the moment where you need to make that in-text citation, having something to refer to is probably going to be the most helpful for you. So do know that those resources are on this guide. I'm also going to point out that at the top here, we have a citation guide, one specifically on in-text citations, as well as a guide that will just help you make citations in general. And I can never remember if it's called avoiding, here we are, citations. So if you're making a works cited page and you're not really sure where to start or how to go about doing it, this literally walks you through it step by step. If you have any questions at all, know that the librarians can help you with your citations. So if you go to the main library page, here, let's do this real quick. You'll notice that on this right-hand side, there's this little chat box. If I click here, it will connect you directly with a librarian. So if you have questions about in-text citations, how to make a works cited page, this is a 24/7 staffed service. So if you are working at your paper at 3 in the morning, there is someone there to help you. It won't be me. I work during the day, but it will be a librarian who's familiar with citation styles. Before we end, I do want to point out at the end of our workshop, we have our own works cited page, just so you know, we did not plagiarize and take other people's work without giving note. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and open the floor for conversation. Know that our workshop has basically come to an end. It's 12:17. So we have a few minutes for questions. If people have any questions, feel free to put that in the chat box or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Leaving the floor open for you. Good question. Okay.
So, I don't know about anyone else, but I couldn't hear the question. Could you restate it?
Yes. So and this is, sorry, the sound went out a little bit. So let me know if I'm paraphrasing what you're asking correctly. Paraphrasing, huh? Is that the link that you're using to try to get back to the database isn't working? Like you're copying and pasting the link from an article you found, and then it's not taking you directly back to that article. Does that sound about right? Okay. So the reason that is because there is a login component to the database, and you need to get the permalink part of the article and not just the URL that's at the top. So just to show you what that looks like, let's say I am in a database. I'm going to log in real quick. I'll do something. Okay, let's say I'm looking on articles for climate change. I just need an example here. So if I click on this article, the URL at the top here is constantly going to be changing based off of your login information. The part that you want to save to be able to get back to this article is actually on the right-hand side here, and it's called a permalink. If you click permalink, it will create a link directly back to the article, and it will take you to this article specifically instead of just the database in general. So if you're going to be wanting to get back to a particular article, most databases have this. They call it either a permalink or a stable URL, and that is what you want to look for. And I'm also going to add that off of, sorry, I have lots of screens up right now. I have your faces in the chat box and all sorts of stuff. There is a guide on here called Beyond Database Basics. And it has some videos in here that will show you actually how to create an account within a database so you can save the articles in the database itself. So very similar to any app you use. If you create your own login, you can just save the database, the articles within the database. So if that's something that you're interested in, this video will walk you through that process as well. We always say you should double check. They tend to be mostly okay, but they make mistakes. So definitely whatever citation, if you're using a citation generator or something directly from the database, double check. And if you need something to double check against to know what format it should look like, that's when I would go to the citation guide. And then here there's like a handout that tells you like how it's supposed to look. So if you need something to check it against, I would use the citation guide. All right, well, great questions so far. Does anybody have anything else that they're curious about? So I will let you guys know that this is the end of the workshop. So if you have any more questions, we'll stick around for a few more minutes and are happy to answer anything. But at this point, you are free to go about your day, and we thank you for coming.
Thank you all very much for coming, and thanks for your questions.
Yes, you guys are like the most interactive group I've had in a while, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. You don't want to hear like you're talking into the void. So thank you for your wonderful questions and kind comments. Thank you for attending.